Welcome, everyone. Great to see you all. And if you enjoy our discussion, please let friends know. It'll be up on our Facebook and our YouTube page soon. We're talking today about a 40-minute piece I called Appearances. It's about the resurrection appearances of Christ as envisioned by three medieval mystics, one central to each movement. It was written 2.5 years ago in celebration and thanks to the Choral Society for putting up with me as a conductor for 20 years. It's now 2 years later, and we're finally getting to the first performance, which was about to happen 2 weeks after things shut down in March of 2020. So I'm first going to share the libretto. The first of the three scenes, each scene has quotations from the Bible, from resurrection appearances in the different gospel accounts, and the choir generally sings those, either the voice of God or the voice of Jesus, and the soloist sings the words of either the biblical character, in this case Mary Magdalene in the first verse, or the words of an ecstatic vision of one of the medieval mystics, in this case Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila, just to give a little background on her, she lived in the 16th century, that's the 1500s, in Spain. She committed herself to the Carmelite order of nuns and founded a reformed version of the Carmelites known as the decalced nuns, that is, those without shoes. Her mystical writings, The Interior Castle and The Way of Perfection, with enigmatic aphorisms and passionate dialogues with the risen Christ, have drawn intense interest from those both within and outside the church for centuries. In fact, her verses, which are some of those aphorisms, are sung in Spanish, the original Spanish, because they're very hard to translate. One of them here, Alma, buscarte has en mí, soul, seek yourself in me, y a mí buscarme has en ti, and seek me within yourself, that we'll hear in just a moment. The movement opens with a long, very quiet section for just the low strings and harp. The scene is dawn, the appearance in the Gospel of John, and we begin with a dialogue that comes from one of Teresa's writings, and some chords that are sort of enigmatic chords that recur throughout the three movements. And what I was trying to do harmonically here is to come up with scales that would not be strictly major or minor, happy or sad in the Western tradition, but a little bit more open-ended, because the subject of life after death is one that we can only speculate about. And so these opening chords sort of set the scene for that. Here's the opening bars of the choral entrance.
Oh
So they're singing, again, this is from the imagination of Teresa of Avila. In her writing, she imagines a scene where she is having a conversation with the risen Christ, appearing to her, and the risen Christ says, "O soul, what is it that you desire of me?" She responds, "My God, I want no more than to see you." And in this next scene, Christ, voiced by the chorus, answers, "And what is it that you fear most for yourself?" And she responds after, which we won't hear because we don't have the soloist here until Tuesday, "What I fear most is to lose you." And here we leave Teresa's vision and go to the passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and says to her, "Why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?" And she responds, "If you have taken him, tell me where." And Jesus responds by calling her out by her name, Mary. And she in turn calls back with the name that she called him, Mary Magdalene called Christ when he was alive, which is Rabboni, or teacher, from which the name rabbi comes from. In the Bible passage then, Christ responds, Mary grabs his feet to touch him, to see if he's real, and Christ says, "Let go of my feet, do not hold me, I am no longer bound by this world." To which Mary responds, "My Lord and my God." Singing the solos here is my wife, Jane Camp. I originally wrote the solo part for her, but that was 2 years ago. And in that time, she's 2 years older and decided that with her work responsibilities and otherwise, and where her voice was, it would be better for someone else to sing the part. So she's singing in the chorus this time and singing the solo parts here to help us practice the back and forth.
Oh,
It says, "My Lord and my God, do not leave me." And Christ responds again in the voice of the chorus by saying her name. The movement closes with the aphorism that I mentioned before, the words in Spanish of Teresa, "Soul, seek yourself in me and seek me within yourself. Buscarte has en mí, y a mí buscarme has en ti." And here you will hear a scale that, again, a made-up scale that is meant to be, to not fit into our emotional normal responses to major and minor scales, but to point to something more without being too abstract at the same time. So the orchestra for this is the same orchestration as for the original Fauré Requiem, which we're doing on the first half of the program. That is violas and cellos and basses, low strings, with two horns, harp, and timpani. So it's a very spare texture, but it's also very different from a piano. It's very sustained for the most part. Let me bring up the second part of the text. Second scene, which is the earthquake scene, which happens in Matthew, and I borrowed some text from the Gospel of Luke as well. And here our mystic is Hildegard von Bingen, a German mystic. Let me just, she is the earliest of the three women. She's from the 11th century, 1098 to 1179, back in the day, as they would say, 12th century. German monastic of the Benedictine order, whose writings were extraordinarily influential for a woman of her time, or any time for that matter. Not only was she a composer of music that was published and kept for us longer and from an earlier source than any other named composer in the Western tradition, but she wrote mystic theology, and she wrote in medicine. She wrote her own original poetic texts, and her visions of the risen Christ are unexpectedly extravagant and sensual. So we'll start at the beginning. We have a suggestion of the earthquake scene from glissandi and percussive effects in the harp and timpani, which of course you won't hear here because you can't really do quite that on a piano. And the soloist, in the voice of the mystic, sings, "I heard a voice speaking to me from the living fire." And the response of the choir, being the voice of the risen Christ in Hildegard's vision, is, "Poor earthly creature, my light touches your inmost being with fire like the burning sun. Shout and tell. Do not be afraid." this and the earlier section, we heard the different parts of the choir, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, all singing very independently of each other, singing the same motive melodically, but at a different time to suggest a large gathering of people caught up in an ecstatic vision. Next, we'll hear from the Bible now, rather than Hildegard, the voice of Christ. In this case, the voice of the angel at the tomb, saying, "He is not here; he is risen. Why do you seek the living among the dead? Proclaim openly the justice which you know for yourself. Tell the mysteries as you understand them in the Spirit, as I speak them through you." Those last two lines, proclaim openly the justice, are Hildegard. The previous two, do not be afraid, he is not here, he is risen, from the Gospel of Luke. Singing, "He is not here." Then there's an extended solo section, and if you tune in the middle of next week, we'll have an excerpt from that as part of our video of the Tuesday night first rehearsal with orchestra and with our guest soloist. The mystic sings, "And I saw a light-filled man emerge from the storm and pour his brightness over the darkness. It repulsed him. He turned blood red and pallid, but struck back against the darkness with such force that he became visible and resplendent, and standing up, he came forth out of the darkness." Again, this is the extravagant language of Hildegard von Bingen. The choir and soloists then together continue in this vision in the imagination of Hildegard and in her language. "He appeared in greater splendor than any human tongue can express. And he proceeded to the utmost heights of immeasurable glory, where he shone out wondrously in the fullness of great fragrance and fruitfulness. Very unusual language, but again, a very original woman, poet, mystic, scientist, composer, who we're very fortunate to even know of today, 1,000 years later. Now we move to the third movement, which is I just call peace, because the scene from John where he says, "Peace be with you, my own peace I give you." And here we have the words of Julian of Norwich, who was an English anchoress, that is, one who lived anchored in a enclosed room with just a few windows, one of which opened to the inside of a church, in this case a church in Norwich, England, where she communicated with the world, counseled people, had food brought to her, but lived a life of contemplation that was both very isolated and very connected. A serious illness and near-death experience when she was 30 years old resulted in her major work called Revelations of Divine Love, in which she elaborates a series of ecstatic visions, or what they call showings, of Christ. This work, Revelations of Divine Love, is the earliest surviving work by a woman in English. One of her visions, a unique uncoupling of the idea of sin from that of personal shame, is the basis for the third movement. I want to look at that text with you briefly before we hear some of it. Again, this is a dialogue. I often wondered why, Julian says, through the great and all-knowing wisdom of God, that sin was not prevented. And the biblical response of Christ, "Peace be with you, my own peace I give you," again sung by the choir. The mystic sings again, "I did not see sin, for I believe that sin has no kind of substance, no share in being, nor can it be recognized except by the pains which it causes." Choir responds again, "But I do not give to you as the world gives." Hildegard again, "These words were revealed very tenderly, showing no kind of blame to me or to anyone." The words of Christ again from the Gospel of John, "Do not let your heart be troubled or dismayed." And again from Hildegard, "He comforts readily and sweetly with his words, meaning this: it is true that the sin we were born into is the cause of all this pain. But all will be well, and every kind of thing will be well." That line is probably the most famous of Julian's lines, but the context before it is not so well known and is quite remarkable. I don't know of any other discussion of the idea of sin or human failing that is so sympathetic to the human condition and portrays a very different view of God's response than is often the case. Let's listen then to the choir singing, but all will be well and every kind of thing will be well. Then jumping ahead to close, again, that comes at the end of the long dialogue between the soloist and the chorus. We close with one of the best-known aphorisms of Teresa of Avila. The two verses that the soloist sings and then the choir responds, "See how love is strong, mira que el amor es fuerte. Life, do not trouble me, vida, no me seas molesta. See how it only remains for me to find you by losing you. Mira que solo me resta para ganarte, perderte." The choir sings, "Vivo sin vivir en mí. I live without living within myself. Y tan alta vida espero. And so I hope for such a transcendent life que muero porque no muero, that I die now in this life because I do not die in eternity." This is the choir singing the last line of that que muero porque no muero. So those are just a few musical excerpts from it. Again, it's just the choir, no orchestra, not in one of our two beautifully resonant halls that flatter the voices so well, Trinity, Lutheran in Lansdale, and Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Doylestown. So any questions or thoughts anyone wants to share?
I'd be interested in knowing how this work came to you. I mean, did it come in pieces? Did it come all at once? I mean, there's a lot of creativity in this, and yeah.
Well, the thoughts of what comes after death have been something I've molded in my mind since I was a child. I guess that's maybe a weird kind of child, maybe it's some kind of mystic in me, but trying to imagine why we're in this world and what our purpose could be and what comes after. And it's interesting in religious traditions, including Christianity, there's quite a variety of suggestions of what comes after. There isn't really, people think in Christianity there's this unified idea of this heaven that's sort of everybody walking around like they are on earth, and the guy with the beard ruling over things. And there's really nothing like that in the Bible, nothing to suggest that. Everything suggests that it's both our essence and our soul continue, but in a form that that we can't see now. We only see through a glass darkly. That's why the references for do not hold me, let go of me, let go of my feet. Do not try to grasp in the moment here on earth, but trust that we are part of something larger. I've been myself living in the Christian tradition since I was a child, starting in Catholicism, and then period where I considered leaving music and going into the priesthood in the Episcopal Church. Decided that wasn't my calling, went back into music, and consider myself within the tradition, but a questioning believer, or not knowing a lot of things. Many of the great composers were agnostics, people we might not ordinarily think of as agnostics, or those who not. It's different than an atheist. An agnostic is someone who is deeply connected to a tradition, but is open to their uncertainty. Ralph Vaughan Williams, who wrote many of the great hymns, was in that category. Herbert Howells, certainly Johannes Brahms, who wrote his great Requiem, struggled with this throughout his life. So I knew I wanted to write a piece like this. I was drawn to these mystical writers, and I thought, what if, since there's relatively little in the Bible itself that you could do something with, why not look into the writings and see if there are poetic articulations of these very personal visions that these women had, that could be put in dialogue with the chorus, singing the words of the angels, singing the word of Christ, and so on. And so I gradually built the libretto over a course of a few months, and then started writing.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, so Tom, I sat back and really enjoyed listening to this, and listening to your comments. And I was struck by, and I love your commentary on whether you chose certain parts to be the center or the golden ratio, whatever you call it. What came to me was in the third movement, what seems to be the center to me, and the golden mean or whatever, is the most familiar line of Julian of Norwich, where she says, "But all will be well, and every kind of thing will be well." Like, to me, that's the center of it. But what really impressed me is that that's the part you set very simply and very dance-like, and it's very different than the rest. So I didn't know if you did that intentionally or if it just kind of happened that way subconsciously, because to me that's the center, but it's also the very life-giving, dance-like message of God through Julian of Norwich, that all will be well.
Yeah, that was, I tried to, it's a very spare piece overall, and I tried to keep a combination of alternating between simplicity and the uncertainty of the scales and where they're going. For a lot of Teresa's music, especially her aphorisms in the first and last movement, I use Spanish rhythms underneath as a reference to her origins, and yeah. So I tried to keep it grounded, simple, and transparent, open. And again, it's hard to duplicate that in a gymnasium parish hall with an out of tune piano, without the orchestra and so on. But it gives you a little idea. Any other questions before we wrap up? I want to respect everybody's time. Well, thank you all for coming, and please help spread the word. Hearing it in person is the best way to hear it. There will be a video afterwards, but there's nothing like it's created for a live performance experience. And we're looking forward to next week. We hear it for the first time all together.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.